Hey everybody, my name is Steven and I am the host of the Going Somewhere podcast. And before we jump into today's episode, I want to thank you for watching today. If you haven't already, please subscribe so you can stay up to date with every new episode and leave some comments. Let us know what your big takeaways are and how this podcast is impacting you. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful host, Steven. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of the Going Somewhere podcast. Today, I am joined by Debra, Fileta. And before we introduce her, I'm just going to read her bio and then we'll go from there. So Debra is a licensed professional counselor, national speaker, relational expert, and author of Reset, Powerful Habits to Own Your Thoughts, Understand Your Feelings, and Change Your Life. Also, True Love Dates, Choosing Marriage, Love in Every Season, as well as Are You Really Okay? She's also the host of the Hotline Style Love and Relationships podcast. Her popular relationship advice blog, True Love Dates, reaches millions of people with the message that healthy people make healthy relationships. Welcome to the podcast, Debra.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. When you hear your bio and just some of the things that you've done over the last several years, what comes to mind for you?
Well, two thoughts. Number one, I think that all of that doesn't really define me. I think what really defines me is the fact that I love Jesus and that he's given me a heart and passion to help people heal. And that's just so exciting to me. It's just incredible that I get to do this work. And then secondly, I think, wow, God has really brought me far. And I think sometimes we have a tendency to look forward at where we want to go instead of seeing where God has already brought us. And so when I just think about where God has already brought me instead of where I want to go next, I'm just so filled with gratitude.
That's awesome. Do you mind just kind of filling in our listeners a little bit more about yourself? I love that you started with, first and foremost, you're somebody who loves Jesus. And I think that is so incredible. But who else is Debra? Where are you at? And just kind of, how did you get to where you're at today?
Well, I'm a licensed counselor and I'm a wife of 15, almost 16 years. And I have 4 kids and we live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And we are just in a rich season, busy, full, rich, with the kids and ministry and life and jobs and homeschooling and all the things.
Wow.
But we're grateful.
How old are your kids, or what's the age span?
My youngest is 2 and the oldest is 12. So there's a 10-year gap between the oldest and the youngest, and there's 2 in the middle.
Do the older ones kind of act as parents every once in a while too?
For sure. The 12-year-old is like so responsible. And then there's 3 boys. So it's girl and then 3 boys. So we have responsible. And then the boys are like wild and fun and crazy.
Responsible and chaos.
Yeah, exactly.
We have a 4-year-old daughter who thinks she's 12. So we get the responsible side, except the capability is not always
she thinks she can
standard.
Do everything, but yeah, I get it.
Carries baby brother around everywhere she goes. He's like half her size, but it all works out. You said you're from Lancaster. I was actually out east for 2 years. We lived in South Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia. And Lancaster, the Amish community is deep there. And we made Saturday trips to the Amish market just about every Saturday. We lived out east.
It's fun. It is super fun living here, and just culturally diverse area, from everything from, minorities to typical Pennsylvania. I put myself in the minority category as well. And then Amish, it's just an eclectic community, and it's really fun to be here. But I'll say South Jersey is a long way from North Dakota. So
It is. Work brought us out there, and then work brought us back. So
yeah, well, that's neat.
We're glad we had the experience. It was during COVID. And so we had 6 months of kind of like normalcy, figuring out what life is like, and then it all shut down. And then speaking of the Amish market, we had to stand outside because only like 15 people could be in at one time. And I needed to get my pretzels, my homemade pretzels. I needed them.
That's so funny.
Yeah. Well, hey, your book Reset just recently came out, and I've gotten the chance to read some of it, and it is so good. What kind of led you to writing that book in particular?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It literally is just hot off the press. It hasn't even been a week yet. It came out on March 14th. And it's a book of 31 practices to help you heal and change from the inside out. I think a lot of times we want to change something in our life. And I see people all the time in counseling who are like, hey, I'm struggling with depression or anxiety or this bad habit or this addiction or this area of sin and struggle in my life. It could even be like, I have an anger problem or I'm on my phone too much. Like we all have something in our life we want to change. In fact, if I asked you right now to think of that thing and just hold it in your mind, you probably have something that God's like, I want you to work on this. I want you to heal in this area. I want you to grow. And if you don't have something, I think that's concerning because we should always be on a journey of healing. Like I think of when in scripture, the Pharisee was like, thank you, Lord, that I'm not like that tax collector. And I think sometimes we can have that attitude, like, thank you, Lord, that I'm not like everybody else in this world. This world is crazy and sinful and it's going down and America's ... But it's like, what does God want to heal in me? And the problem though, is that oftentimes we pursue change, but we pursue it from the outside in and we pursue it with our willpower. But willpower doesn't last forever. So at some point we break down and we default back to old habits. And so this is a book about long-lasting change. This is a book about resetting from our default mode and starting to do it differently. And I've poured everything that I know as a counselor, the highlights, the most important lessons into these 31 practices that I really think will be a sustainable, practical, bite-sized way to kind of help people move through the journey of healing.
Awesome. I know I loved the length of the chapters are amazing. The questions that you can go through and really as you're reading it, obviously it's not the equivalent of a counseling session with you, but there's so much, even just going through some of the chapters myself and talking through with my wife, there was so much that we were taking away from it and applying immediately, which was super impactful. And you talk about inside out change and how our thoughts impact our feelings, which impact our behaviors. Do you just want to talk about that and how that happens?
Yeah. So I start the book with this story of a lemon of a car I had in college. This car was so frustrating. It had all these mechanical issues, like the windshield wipers would just go off. The alarm would start to blare randomly. Like I'd be driving and the alarm would start to blare. Like it was so annoying.
Perfect. Yeah.
The windows would roll down just out of nowhere. And I could have fixed those problems superficially. I could have duct taped the windows. I could have taken off the windshield wipers. I could have muffled the alarm. But the problem is, if I wasn't getting to the root of why this was happening to begin with, I wasn't actually fixing the problem, right? I'm just fixing the symptoms.
Right.
And I think we often do that in our life. We see these symptoms, we try to change them, we try to affect it from the outside in, superficial change. But that's not real and lasting change. So a huge part of the healing journey means we have to go underneath the hood. We have to go underneath the surface and figure out why it is that I'm doing what I'm doing. What is leading me to these behaviors to begin with? And when we go underneath the surface, we will find out that it's our thoughts that influence our feelings, which then motivate our behaviors. So what you think about a situation is going to start causing you to feel a certain way. And then out of that feeling, you start behaving a certain way. So instead of just trying to change the behavior, I really have to get to the root of where these thoughts came from, what they are, but also where they came from, and begin the healing journey on a deeper level rather than just a superficial healing.
That's so good. And I think so many people want change. You know, they want, whether it's a negative habit to stop or a positive habit to start. But why is change so hard? And maybe speaking from the psychological place, like why is change so hard for us ordinary everyday people?
Yeah, it is true. We all want change and it is hard. You know, over 95% of New Year's resolutions have failed by this point. Like we're in March. our New Year's resolutions are in the gutter at this point, like we're back to eating junk. We stopped going to the gym. We're back on our screens, not being present, like all the things that we wanted to do differently. And I think a component to that is because it's easier to default to what's familiar over what's healthy. And I also think healing takes work and change takes work. Like going underneath the surface sounds easy, but it's not. It takes work. And someone recently asked me, like, healing is hard, Debra. Why should we be motivated to heal when healing is such hard work? And I said, healing is hard work, but living unhealed is even harder because it seeps into every part of your life. The wounds that you're living with, the idea that you're living unhealed is a burden that you carry with you for the long haul. And it affects your family, your marriage, your career, your ministry, everything. So yeah, healing is hard, but living unhealed is so much harder. So that's what I hope people will be motivated to realize, that in order for me to actually change, I need to do things differently. Clearly, the way that I've done things up until this point isn't working for me. So instead of just trying to do it again and again and again in the same way, I have to actually come up with a new plan and start to do it differently. So that's what I hope to offer the reader, is just kind of open their eyes to their default mode and offer them a perspective and a practical plan to start doing it differently.
That's awesome. And I think for many young adults that are maybe at the end of college, post-college, getting married, having kids, I feel like, at least in my case, so many of those default settings became more of a reality to me. I even think of just relationships with my family. Like there were just things that didn't just all of a sudden boil over or show up and like, whoa, my dad changed or my mom changed. But I think so many of those things have just been underlying, and now I'm in a new season and adjusting to those default settings. Is that something that you come across of as like transition points being kind of a trigger for some of that need for healing and that pain to kind of surface?
Yeah, I think oftentimes when we go through a season and we hit a wall, we realize, like, I got to do things differently. Like it's not just about doing what has always been done. It's about finding a new norm. And I think as you get older, you do realize that so much of your default has to do with your family of origin, and not just in the way that your family did things, but in the things that you learned in the role that you played in the home. For example, I worked with a woman who came from a family of 8, and there was just so many kids and so many needs in the home. And she was one of the oldest. And like we were just talking about, we have the oldest child, right? I'm actually the oldest. I have a child, my firstborn. So I know the role of the firstborn tends to be responsible and tends to want to be helpful. And this young woman I was working with had spent so much of her life addressing the needs of other people and learning that she kind of had to put her needs on the back burner because there were so many needs. There's so many other people in the family. There wasn't room for her needs. That's kind of the belief system that started developing in childhood. And she carried that with her through her adulthood. So even in romantic relationships, in dating, she would find herself putting their needs first and not addressing her needs, kind of just keeping her needs to herself, ignoring her needs. And her goal was to kind of meet the needs of this person, which, as you can imagine, led to one-sided relationship after one-sided relationship after one-sided relationship. And she's like, why do I keep attracting these unhealthy relationships? Well, part of it is because that is stirring something in you. You're defaulting back to some of those old roles. And you've got to learn to reset, to do it differently. And so when she was able to understand that some of the reasons that she was doing this had to do with her past and the roles she had in her family, and honestly, the need for deeper healing, the need for God to kind of shine his light of healing on some of those wounded places in her past and begin to shift things. So oftentimes we do default to things from our past without even realizing it.
To my own journey, there were those things as kind of the season reset that, without kind of taking time to stop and pause and actually kind of go to the root or go to the place, that inside out place, I just kind of was like spinning my wheels, and things on the surface kept feeling like they were out of place, yet it was my heart, it was the internal. And I actually started seeing a counselor about 2 years ago, and it was the most impactful decision that I made. And it just made me think, like, why don't more people, specifically Christians, why don't Christians take advantage of that? And what role can a Christian counselor like yourself play in somebody's path to healing?
I think we struggle to admit our weaknesses. And I also think the church hasn't had the best relationship with mental and emotional health. Like, I think oftentimes we assume that when we come to Jesus, we're going to be set mentally and emotionally. Like, we're good to go.
Right.
But we don't make that same assumption with our physical health. Like, when we come to Jesus, we don't expect that all of a sudden we're going to have a six-pack and biceps and our cholesterol levels are going to be just right. And like, we don't make that assumption. Wouldn't that be amazing? But it's funny because it's laughable. Like, we're kind of like joking about it. But to be honest, we have that approach with emotional and mental health. We think it's just going to happen. But just like physical health requires work and exercise and diet and nutrition and going to the gym, well, emotional health and mental health require work. And I kind of consider counseling like going to the gym. Like, I am going to strengthen these muscles that will otherwise atrophy if left alone. They're not just going to strengthen themselves if I'm not doing the work. And so I think sometimes we struggle because of what we've been taught. We believe that it's wrong to struggle or not be okay in a certain area. Or we're worried that going outside of the Bible is going to be harmful. But that's the whole idea of finding a counselor who is founded in God's truth and somebody that can walk this journey alongside of you. When your toilet is broken, you call a plumber, right? So why not, when you're struggling in your emotions and with your thoughts and your past, your trauma history, connect with a counselor. And I have an amazing team of counselors at Debra, the Fileta Counselors Network, that are just men and women of God who are really good at what they do. So that's always an option if somebody's wondering, like, what's that next step look like?
That's so good. I will definitely, if we can, link that in the show notes as well. I know for me, one of the things that stood out in my journey was kind of, to start, you have to stop. And I love that your first chapter is about pause. And it's just,
I think it throws people off a little bit.
Right. But I think, like you even talk about in the book, like, there's so much in motion in our lives constantly. And for this part to start to change, and for us in behaviors and all those things, we do need to stop. So what's kind of the power of pause, and why is that the first thing that you wrote about?
It definitely throws people off because I think the introduction is so energizing and motivating, and you read it and you're like, man, I can change. I can do this differently. Let's go. And then you open to the first practice and it's pause. It's like, what? Like, I'm ready to go. And you're telling me to stop. It's so counterintuitive when you're ready to go.
Yeah.
But if I had to choose a theme verse for this book, it would be Proverbs 20, verse 5, which says, the purposes of a person's heart are like deep waters, but one who has insight draws them out. In order to begin to heal, you have to draw out what's inside your heart, the purposes, the motivations, the underlying reasons of why you do what you do. You have to draw it out, and it doesn't come naturally. But in order to have insight and awareness, there has to be a level of stillness so that you can stop and focus and learn and listen and align yourself to what God is revealing. Not just choosing whatever random thing it is I want to change in my behavior, but actually aligning it to what God wants me to shift and heal. And every practice in this book comes with a verse for reflection. And the verse for reflection for that first practice, pause, comes from the book of Job. Job had just gone through this traumatic, chaotic experience of losing his children and his livestock and all of these things. And he was like struggling and looking for a reset, coming to the Lord for help. And the Lord says to him, first thing, pause for a moment and listen. Like, stop talking and listen. Like, let me fill you in with this journey of healing and what it's going to look like and what I'm doing and what I want to spotlight. But we live in a culture that's just so go, go, go. Like there's so much noise all around us. So you said a minute ago that at the end of each practice, there's these activities. It's not just like you could read this book from cover to cover, probably in a few hours, but you won't get anything out of it if you don't do the work at the end of each chapter. And so at the end of the first chapter, I guide you through a practice of just pausing and turning off your devices and just sitting for 10 minutes and kind of what to think about and what to do during that time. I'm telling you, that is hard for people. Like it sounds like, oh yeah, 10 minutes. I mean, the clock goes so slow when you have never sat undistracted for 10 minutes. And then when you silence the external noise, then your awareness increases to the internal noise. Like your brain is going 100 miles a minute because there's so many internal thoughts. You have to even learn to still and quiet those and allow yourself to go into listening mode rather than speaking mode. And even that is hard to do because it's something that we don't do very often. It's a skill that has been lost in our society. So making space to heal begins with pausing and learning to listen.
So good. You just mentioned it, but the external and the internal noise, and you talk about it in the book, but what would, I think the external noise kind of is self-explanatory, but can you define those two things and what they kind of look like in our lives?
Yeah. So external noise would be anything from your cell phone to your children, to your texts pinging every 5 seconds, to Netflix, YouTube, music, podcasts. We always have something in our ear. Even when you're driving to church or work, we rarely drive in silence.
Right.
We usually have some sort of noise on, but noise distracts our mind. It brings our mind to the attention of that thing, which is fine. The problem is it's not fine if we never take the time to be still. And sometimes people honestly don't want to be still because then they're left with their thoughts, the internal noise. And sometimes you realize the internal noise is actually not that good. It's negative. It's shame-filled. It's I'm not good enough. Life is hard. Things aren't working out for me. Like oftentimes we have this negative thinking, these negative thinking patterns that are constantly in our mind. So we try to block them out with noise or these fears, these doubts, worst case scenarios, right, worries, whatever it is. But it's so important for us to tune out of what's going on around us, tune into what's going on inside of us, and begin to kind of start recognizing the type of thoughts that we tend to have. Because later on in the book, we talk about learning to take inventory of your thoughts. I call it owning your thoughts, because that internal noise, we've got to learn from it. We've got to do something with it.
That's so good. And I think that internal, when that kind of starts, when I start to think about what I'm thinking about,
exactly.
Like you say, take inventory of those thoughts. I think sometimes I almost then turn on the external noise again of kind of drowning that out. And I think I'd love for you just to speak to that. I think there's some habits and things that we have in our life, whether it's just how we engage in Netflix and other streaming services, or just how we just relate to our phones in a everyday ongoing sense. And a lot of those habits maybe seem harmless, being tired after a long day and turning on Netflix, or being tired, or just having like a free moment to picking up our phone. But what is it about those that can actually be a revealer to us of, hey, there's something going on here?
Well, oftentimes we do it as an escape. Oftentimes we do it to escape from difficult feelings or experiences. Oftentimes we're stressed, we're anxious, we're overwhelmed. And so we want to tune out from what's happening inside of us and escape into these other things. We want to tune out some of that pain that we're feeling by distracting ourselves. And so the problem is some of that pain and some of those feelings are actually really revealing. They're signals that God has given us. Like when you're stressed, that is a signal. It's like telling you something. Hey, pay attention. There's something you need to
Right.
pay attention to, something you need to change and shift. But if we're constantly drowning out the signals of our emotions with our screens, with alcohol, with gaming, with Instagram, then we're just blocking the signals, and we're not tuning in to the fact that the dash lights are going off and saying like, hey, something's going down, pay attention, this isn't good,
Right.
And so we just keep going until we can't go anymore, until we hit a breaking point, until we get to a really bad place. I mean, this generation, 20s and 30s, there is so much anxiety, so many anxious thoughts, panic attacks, difficult feelings, waking up in the middle of the night with heart palpitations, your heart's going crazy because you feel anxious and you don't know why, feeling this heaviness on your chest. Like, we live in a culture where there is so much anxiety. And instead of dealing with it and revealing it, we're trying to block it out. We're trying to drown it out. We're trying to escape from it. And so my prayer for this book is that it would help individuals realize that sometimes we've got to go underneath the surface and actually deal with it in order to begin to heal from it, rather than just block it out.
That's so good. I know for me, kind of what started, I've always been open, not always, but I learned, I was like, okay, counseling is good. Cause I think I did have that kind of maybe misconception of, as a Christian, I shouldn't, it reveals something of my weakness. And
right. Like it's a weakness of faith or a sin in your life. Or even another misconception is you don't go unless it's like really bad, like schizophrenia or like extreme addiction or ... Like we don't even allow ourselves to just not be okay,
Right. And what I learned so quickly was that it was the tools and the practices that helped me the most. And what actually kind of sparked that kind of decision of going from like, I should do that to like, okay, I'm doing it, was I was in kind of like a normal, ordinary situation. And I kind of had like my first ever panic attack where my chest got tight and breathing was kind of difficult. And like what led to it wasn't this big thing that happened, a blow up in a relationship. It was just small things that kind of piled on. And then all of a sudden I found myself kind of feeling like things were closing in. And then I drove a 20-hour road trip like the next day because I had to drive back home. We were living on the East Coast, and that 20 hours of silence and just being alone. And it was great time for prayer, but I realized, man, there's some things here. And I realized I had to go back in order to go forward. And I know that's something you talk about in the book as well. So what would you say to somebody that's maybe like, I don't want to go back. I don't know what I'm going to find there. I don't know what I'm going to pick up a rock and what's going to be under it.
Yeah. First of all, let me just remind you that human beings are like a volcano. Like the pressure can only build to a certain point until it has to find the point of least resistance, and it will come up into your life in the form of some sort of an emotional explosion. Wow. That's kind of what you went through, that experience of like the pressure is building and building and little, it's not one thing, it's little things. And not only that, it's not just bad things. Good things cause pressure too. And all the pressure starts to build and build and build and build. And all of a sudden even something that's not huge can set it off. And there's an emotional explosion, whether it be a panic attack, depression, an addiction resurfaces in your life that maybe you haven't dealt with in a long time, negative thought patterns, a relationship conflict, a really bad decision, a lapse of judgment. Like these are the things that come up. And oftentimes we have to kind of start unpacking like what's going on underneath that volcano. And like you said, I always talk about going back in order to go forward. I find it to be almost exciting when the Lord brings up something, because he's like, I'm trusting you now. I'm inviting you into a deeper level of healing.
Wow. Yeah.
And I'm revealing something here and now so that you can deal with it in a deeper way. Like I want to partner with you on the journey of healing. He's revealing something to you. And I look at our past, and I know our past can be powerful. Trauma is powerful. Past sins, abuse, history, bad decisions we've made, the hurts we've experienced in childhood, all of that is hard and powerful. But you know what? You are more powerful because of Christ at work in you. And you can look back at that stuff and look it square in the eye and say, yes, that's powerful, but I am more powerful because of who Jesus is at work in me here and now. And we can look at that stuff and face it and heal from it and shift our perspective on it, invite God into some of those dark places so that we can begin to heal. And I really believe when we begin to shift things from our past, we'll find inevitably it changes things in our present as well.
That idea of the volcano and it is so powerful because I think avoiding it or suppressing it can kind of put it off for another day.
But then maybe the explosion will be bigger than it would have been, right?
Right.
It's like, I'm just going to keep shoving the pressure down as long as possible. What we don't realize is we might actually be creating a bigger explosion when it does come.
Right. And in my case, like there was a level of, I'm a pretty joyful person, a bubbly person, outgoing person. And then that was kind of when I started to realize like there'd been a shift even in my external behavior that I'd probably just been pushing away and not really calling it out and owning where I actually was. That was really kind of the start of that healing journey that I'm still on. I think we all are still on there, but there's young adults today that are maybe listening and they're saying, yeah, I don't feel like the volcano erupting. I don't feel, I don't look back at my past and see this rubble that I'm coming from. But I think there's a level of each one of us has things that we're working through. So how would you kind of help them navigate today? All right, you're in your early 20s, you're in your early 30s. You may not have a bunch of junk to look back on, but how can you move forward and be as healthy as possible?
Well, let me tell you this. I think we all have a bunch of junk. I really do. I just think it looks different than what we expect. When we think of that, we think of, okay, I don't have an abuse history. I don't have like tons of sexual sin in my past. I don't have an addiction history. I didn't come from family of divorce. I wasn't adopted. Like we think of these big things. But what about that girl I mentioned who comes from a big family and her junk was literally dealing with the fact that she was a people pleaser and focused on the needs of others more than her own.
Right. Wow.
It doesn't have to be crazy for it to be significant. And I think the enemy will take any opportunity to plant lies in our childhood, in our development season, to just throw us off and start causing us to believe things that aren't true about ourselves, about others, about God. I worked with a young man who was bullied in middle school, and he didn't think that had a huge effect on him till later in adulthood when he felt paralyzed and so insecure around people. And it affected his jobs, it affected his dating life. He's like, I don't know why I'm struggling with this insecurity. Well, we kind of traced it back to some of those developmental years and some of the things that he went through, some of the lies that were planted during that season of his life. So it doesn't have to be huge to be significant. And I think sometimes it's the smaller things that actually become significant. So instead of just looking for massive, huge things, look for areas of your life where you have an exaggerated emotional response. In the book, I talk about triggers. Triggers are exaggerated emotional responses. Let's say your boss tells you something like, hey, I could really use you to like get this in time and not be late. And all of a sudden you feel so offended and insecure and like, man, I must be a terrible worker. He doesn't like me. I'm probably going to get fired. And all of a sudden I have this exaggerated emotional response to his simple interaction of telling me to get something done in time. That's a trigger. And that is usually an area that needs to be spotlighted. There's usually something there. Let's say somebody asks you to do something for them and you just get really triggered. Like, I don't have the time for this. Why are they always asking me? Like anytime you have an exaggerated emotional response to a situation, there's a good chance that it's revealing something that needs to be healed. And so look for those exaggerated emotional responses. Look for the triggers in your life. And instead of avoiding them, lean into them. Like, what are they teaching me that needs to be dealt with and healed?
There's so many things in your book that we don't have the time to talk about. And so if you're listening today, make sure you get Reset by Debra Fileta. It's so good. it's something that'll just at least spark these conversations and help you kind of navigate where you're at and how to start. And so thanks so much for writing this book. Thanks so much for taking some time to be with us. And one of the questions I ask every guest on the podcast is, if you were to go back and have a conversation with your 22-year-old self, what advice would you give her?
Oh, I know this right away. I would say, get healthy standing alone, because you attract and engage with people on your level of emotional health. You are like a magnet, and you will draw people into your life and engage with them based on how healthy you are. So if you want to have the chance of a healthy dating relationship and a healthy marriage, then use this season of your life to get healthy standing alone. That's exactly what I would tell my younger self. And my Instagram page, Debra Fileta, is full of dating advice, relationship advice, mental health advice. I love the 20s, 30s crowd. I do a lot of activities and events for singles. We do seminars just for singles, because I really believe that if we focused more on the health of singles now, we'd have way less marriage counseling to do later. So it's my passion to kind of help singles in this season. So I'm so grateful that you had me on, and I'm excited to connect more with you and your tribe and what God is doing in the 20s, 30s crowd.
Absolutely. I know your website, which we'll put in the show notes as well, or one of your websites, thetruelovedates.com, your blog. I know I just kind of got to peruse it, and I'm just so excited for our young adults that are single, that are dating, that are just kind of in that season, to check that out as well as your podcast, Love and Relationships with Debra Fileta. And so is there anywhere else, like where can we get your book? How can we stay connected with you?
Yeah, so the best way is through truelovedates.com and my Instagram. I spend most of my time on Instagram right now as far as like interacting with people. But you can buy Reset anywhere books are sold, and you can learn more about it at my website. Awesome.
Thank you so much for spending some time with us. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we do get to connect down the road again. Appreciate you so much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.